pilgrims have been killed in a stampede at Mina, Saudi Arabia's holy city of Mecca.
More doubt about the Saudi handling of Hajj.
Morning stampede in Mina.
The aftermath of a tragedy.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. These are some of the media stories we're getting across this week. The tragedy in Mecca. One story, differing narratives depending on what channel you're watching in which country. Somehow, the conflict in Crimea has led to the launch of a new television channel in Estonia. No country for journalists. Mexico and the perils of the profession. And the handle is @Snowden. Citizen4 hits Twitter. There are certain news events that, when you examine the coverage of them, reveal much about the larger story. The disaster that struck the Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia's holy city of Mecca is an example of that, reflected through the lenses of Saudi and Iranian media in particular. Two throngs of pilgrims met at an intersection in an area called Mina. What happened next is unclear, as is the death toll. But what we do know is that hundreds of lives were lost. One of the reasons for the confusion, journalists say, is that they were denied access to the scene for up to 7 hours. The larger story is the geopolitics of the region. The news reports coming out of Riyadh and Tehran moved swiftly from sympathy to recrimination. And the ramifications of this story go well beyond the blame game and a bit of bad press, given that it happened in a place that Muslims consider sacred and that Saudi Arabia and Iran are fighting wars by proxy elsewhere in the region. Our starting point this week is Mecca. The city of Mecca is home to 2 million people and the Kaaba, considered by most Muslims to be the holiest site in Islam. During the Hajj, the city's population can more than triple, and this is not the first time that crowd control has fallen short, with lethal results. When the story broke, images began to appear on social media. However, conventional news video did not move across the feeds for another 7 hours. That, journalists have reported, is how long Saudi Arabian security officials kept the international media away from the site.
Saudi Arabia does not want gruesome images, shocking images to appear on television. So the stampede is said to have taken place at 9 a.m. and we arrived at around 4 or 5 p.m. and by the time we arrived, they were still collecting remains of dead people from the streets, but we were not allowed to film, and a lot of journalists were thinking Saudi must have been hiding something from us.
Let's also not forget that the Hajj is a very, very sensitive event. It's the biggest gathering of the Muslims in the world, one of the biggest human gatherings in the world, and it's a very spiritual and religious gathering.
Saudi Arabia says that basically the situation was extremely dangerous. They were more concerned about evacuating the victims and the injured, but the reality is, by restricting the media, Saudi Arabia did a lot of harm to its case. All kinds of stories took shape around this particular tragedy, mostly blaming the Saudi kingdom for not doing enough.
International journalists also report that the Saudi media were allowed to film the scene many hours before reporters from the outside got access. However, the most sustained criticism, and it's been an onslaught, came from media outlets in the Islamic Republic of Iran, led by state-owned television channels there, starting with the death toll, which the Saudis have put at 769. There was talk of mismanagement in Mecca, implications that Saudi indifference to the safety of the pilgrims was to blame.
سعودی ها به دلایل این خیابان رو هم، یعنی خیابان شماره 215 رو مسدود کرده بودن، یعنی این محل رو.
Iranian newspapers echoed the idea that the Saudi government is just not up to the job of hosting the Hajj. In Ebtekar, a reformist paper and no government mouthpiece, the headline read, "Saudi incompetence continues." And Iranian papers went big on a theory that a member of the Saudi royal family and his motorcade crowded streets that were already jammed, making an inherently dangerous situation worse. Armane Emruz, another reformist paper, pulled no punches with this headline. This was not a calamity. This was murder by the Saudi family.
And the Saudis also responding by saying that some Iranian pilgrims we're not listening to the orders and we're going in a different direction, and that's actually what caused the stampedes. But again, going back to the root cause of this mismanagement of the media coverage is that these speculations take their way into the media when the actual coverage has not been very transparent and free. We don't exactly know what happens. Everyone's still waiting.
My observation from the ground was that this stampede took place in a very humble area, an area that only houses foreign pilgrims. So it's very unlikely that any dignitary will be passing. I think the Iranians possibly wanted to show how Saudi Arabia would rather treat its princes well, just wanted to show the so-called racism of Saudi Arabia when dealing with pilgrims from different nationalities.
If you look at Saudi Arabia with jaundiced eyes, if you look at Saudi Arabia with political angles and all that, then you will never find anything good in Saudis or Saudi Arabia. The Saudi ambassador to UK explained that the rumors started by Press TV, which is Iranian television.
According to reports, the prince led authorities to change the direction of the pilgrims movement.
They started spreading these rumors and they started politicizing it. It's a shame that this accident happened. It's a greater shame that Iran and those countries who are linked to Iran have tried to politicize that.
There's a wider context to both the geopolitical and media sides of this story. Shia-led Iran and Sunni-led Saudi Arabia are on the opposing sides of conflicts right across the region: Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, among others. The Saudis learned long ago that investing in media, and not just their own, can produce political dividends. They bankroll TV channels in Lebanon and own pan-Arab newspapers based in London, but read across the Arab world. They also own the Al Arabiya News Network, and by buying stock in Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, they have a piece of Sky News Arabia. In 2010, the Saudi government instructed its satellite company, Arabsat, to drop Iran's Arabic-language news channel, Al Alam, to use, quote, technical means to lessen the Iranian broadcast strength. In this media war, the House of Saud is particularly well armed.
Both Iran and Saudi Arabia have a vested interest in demonizing each other, in misrepresenting the actions of each other. They are fierce rivals, not just in the media and political field, but in various wars that are taking place in the region. And the media war is as fierce as the actual wars that are taking place in Syria, in Iraq, in Bahrain, in Lebanon, and other places.
Saudi Arabia has spent and invested a lot of money and resources into trying to control the media narrative, especially in the Arab world, and also in the broader media landscape more towards the West. And I think they've been pretty successful as far as controlling the narrative to their benefits from the Western, European, and American viewpoint. I don't think Saudi Arabia gets as much bad press in the Western media, especially as, let's say, Iran gets.
But the big point here is that both the Iranian media and the Saudi media have framed the debate, not just in the context of a human tragedy, but in the context of their geostrategic rivalry. And this tells you how fierce the regional Cold War that's taken place between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the Middle East today.
On the download, our viewers weigh in on the geopolitics of reporting Saudi Arabia.
Almost any incident that involves Iran and Saudi Arabia is likely to become political by nature, even if it's the highly emotional tragedy of the Hajj stampede. By politicizing such incidents, states gain a unique opportunity to put a human face on the long-standing political contentions, and in the absence of a strong opposition media, when the public tune in, they face a one-sided narrative of the story.
Saudi Arabia, whose rivalries with Iran but also with other GCC states, has led to the kingdom trying to speak to different audiences to try and secure its national interest but also its legitimacy. We also see it manifesting in the competition over the Hajj in an increasingly politicized view of events.
Other media stories on our radar this week. When the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, finally pardoned those two Al Jazeera journalists September 23rd, there were suggestions that it was part of a charm offensive, time to precede the president's visit to the U.S. and the UN's General Assembly. Sisi has since done the media rounds in New York, where he was asked about Egypt's treatment of journalists. On CNN, he did not just defend his government's record, he lauded it. He told Wolf Blitzer, "I do not want to use cliches, but we have unprecedented freedom of expression in Egypt. No one in Egypt can bar anyone working in media or journalism or on TV from expressing their views." Had the interviewer followed up, which he did not, he might have mentioned that at least 18 journalists remain in Egyptian jails and 7 guilty verdicts still stand against Al Jazeera employees tried in absentia. President Sisi also told the Associated Press that he is open to the idea of clemency in those cases, but would rather not interfere with the judiciary, which is precisely what he did when he pardoned Al Jazeera's Mohammed Fahmy and Bahar Mohammed. The Israeli military says it has suspended one of its officers after an incident on the West Bank in which 2 journalists were assaulted, their equipment destroyed. Captured on a distant camera, the 2 journalists from Agence France Presse, who say they had prior authorization to be in the area near Nablus, can be seen wearing body armor clearly marked as press. Andrea Bernardi from Italy and Palestinian photographer Abbas Momani were both roughed up. Their camera was smashed on the ground. What was left of it was later returned, they say, minus the memory cards and the content. The pair was covering demonstrations following the funeral of a Palestinian killed by Israeli security forces. The Israeli military called the assault a grave incident and suspended the officer until further notice. However, the Foreign Press Association speculated that no disciplinary actions would have been taken had the event not been caught on camera by a Palestinian production company called Pal Media. The FPA added that Israeli military units frequently act with impunity and in direct contradiction with the ideal of high morals Israel's military says it adheres to, and that the army must show it respects the freedom of the press. Estonia has about 1.3 million people, slightly more than 300,000 of them are ethnic Russians, and now they have their own television channel, one that has its roots in the conflict over Ukraine. The public broadcaster, EER, has just launched ETV Plus, a Russian-language news and entertainment channel. Russian-speaking Estonians rely heavily on information broadcast by Russian media outlets, the vast majority of which provide uncritical coverage of Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, and they toe Moscow's line on the annexation of Crimea. The Ukraine-Crimea story has heightened tensions throughout the Baltic states, each of which has large ethnic Russian populations. The head of ETV Plus said that the main goal of the new channel is to create more cohesion in society and to give Russian speakers in Estonia the feeling that they matter. The numbers of those threatened and killed are in dispute. One thing that isn't is that the dangers for journalists in Mexico are real and they are rising. By some counts, Ruben Espinosa became the 11th killed there this year when he was tortured and shot dead August 1st. Investigators are calling it a robbery gone wrong, but friends, colleagues, and press freedom campaigners all say that Espinosa had enemies in the state of Veracruz, where he did most of his work as a photojournalist for Proceso magazine. Days later, Juan Santos Cabrera was shot dead in a bar in Veracruz alongside a reputed gang boss. Just why the former news anchor at Televisa was sharing a table with such a figure is not known, but their proximity that night lends weight, at least superficially, to what has become a truism in Mexico, that journalists who get too close to the drug cartels or that story get what's coming to them. But is it always red note journalism, the sensational tabloid coverage of violence, that gets journalists into trouble? Ruben Espinosa's beat in Veracruz was not crime or the cartels, it was coffee growers, student protesters, and environmentalists. And the threats that he said he had received were from local government officials. And many Mexicans say that that's a trend that's only getting worse. The Listening Post's Will Young now on the complicated, perilous state of journalism in Mexico.
Es un autorretrato. Esta foto también es de él. Este es el gobernador. El gobernador particularmente le molestaba la forma como lo retrataba Rubén. Fue célebre esta foto. Ahora sí que con esta foto Rubén, como decimos en el argot, se ganó la portada de la revista.
For more than a decade, Rubén Espinosa's photojournalism for Proceso and other outlets shone a light on social issues and corruption in the state of Veracruz.
Al momento de salir veo tres tipos que están en la esquina de mi casa con un taxi prendido, ¿no? Noté su presencia porque era muy notoria, ellos querían que yo los viera, ¿no?
Having been beaten by police in the past, Rubén fled to the Distrito Federal, the capital, Mexico City, where journalists fearing for their lives often take refuge.
Dime una cosa, ¿tú presentaste denuncia?
No.
¿No has presentado ninguna
denuncia? Porque no confío en ninguna institución del Estado.
Rubén de plano rechazó.
He rejected any possibility of getting this protection. He felt that the threats were coming from a government body.
Una estructura gubernamental.
And protection from another government body, he thought that was a contradiction. And therefore, he did not believe in that.
Y no creyó en eso.
Espinosa's body was found in his apartment on the 1st of August. Investigators are calling it a robbery gone wrong and have jailed a suspect. But friends, colleagues and press freedom campaigners say that the risks and threats that Espinosa faced in Veracruz had followed him back to the capital.
Contrary to what other journalists do, Rubén made his case public. He spoke about his problem in different media and to all the press freedom organizations. The official body for protecting journalists knew about it as well as the authorities. But despite all this, they couldn't protect him.
The government's responsibility is to provide security for all its citizens. And of course, in the particular case of journalists, to allow them to safely exercise freedom of expression. We equip journalists with tools that allow them to alert us when they're in danger. The state mechanism for protecting journalists by itself will not prevent fatal incidents. We are just one part of the whole, and journalists themselves also need to take responsibility.
I think we cannot really put the burden of proof in the journalists. I mean, how the journalists are protecting themselves. This is a matter of a Mexican state and a national crisis. Protection of the journalists is like a band-aid, but you have a hemorrhage inside, so you need to operate. And the protection laws, maybe they are working. My view is that they are not.
Internacionales.
Javier Duarte became governor of Veracruz State in 2010. Since then, 14 journalists have been killed or disappeared. In May, the body of Armando Saldaña Morales, a Veracruz radio and print journalist, was found with 4 bullets to the head near the state border. He had been reporting on political corruption and oil theft by the cartels. Last year, the body of crime and security reporter Gregorio Jiménez de la Cruz was found in a shallow grave. He'd reported on a local union leader who'd spoken out against organised crime and on abductions at a bar said to be connected to the Zetas gang. Back in 2012, Regina Martinez, who reported on cartels and corruption for Proceso, was found beaten and strangled in her apartment. The list goes on. But officials such as Duarte say the problem isn't just reporting on the cartels, it's that journalists are sometimes in fact working with them. Get too close, they say, and you have it coming.
Lamentablemente, algunos de los colaboradores, trabajadores de los medios de comunicación tienen vínculos con estos grupos. ¿Qué les quiero pedir? Pórtense bien. Todos sabemos quiénes andan en malos pasos.
It's true that covering certain stories can be a danger for journalists, and that's why they need to look after and protect themselves. We have to differentiate between getting close to these criminal groups for information purposes and for purposes other than journalism.
Cuando se trata de cubrir.
In order to report on certain stories, journalists and photographers tread a very fine line. By crossing that line, they can easily end up with the criminal gangs. What Governor Duarte said has a double meaning. On the one hand, it is a kind of threat, but it also reflects the reality in some parts of the country.
Partes del país.
The killing of Juan Santos Cabrera on 13th of August would seem to prove Duarte's point. A former state TV presenter, Cabrera was shot dead in a bar in the city of Orizaba, Veracruz state. His companion that night was José Marquez Balderas, reputed to be the local boss of the Zetas drug gang. But consider the case of Moises Sanchez, the first Mexican journalist to be killed this year. Sanchez drove a taxi and ran a grocery store to fund his own weekly newspaper. Kidnapped on January 2nd, his body was found 3 weeks later, decapitated and mutilated. A former policeman confessed to taking part in the murder and accused the former mayor of ordering it.
To think that everything happens because of organized crime is a mistake. It is not like covering a normal war, because in a normal war you know whose side people are on, where each army is, and who works for them. In Mexico, you don't know if the policeman that you're interviewing works for a cartel, or if the mayor you talk to works for someone else. What we see in the records is that the main aggressor is the state. That can be governors, municipal mayors, or police.
According to government figures, over the past 5 years, protection measures for journalists in Mexico have included 12 bulletproof vests, police escorts and patrols, even a handful of armoured cars. Even so, the rate at which journalists are being killed is only accelerating. And despite the appointment of a special prosecutor for crimes against freedom of expression in 2006, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, fewer than 10% of attacks against journalists and writers result in convictions.
The really serious problem is impunity, because the perpetrator can easily state that nothing will happen to them, and they're not mistaken. 45% of aggressions against the press come from a public servant, whether it's a municipal president or a municipal police, or all the way to the army or the federal authorities.
If no one is punished, if the politician who ordered the killing or disappearing of a journalist is not in prison, then the message is always that it doesn't matter, that in Mexico it is possible to silence a journalist. Ruben's case contradicts the claim that the only journalists at risk are the ones who cover police or cartel stories. He covered general stories. Actually, he didn't like covering crimes, but despite this, he was murdered.
Fue asesinado.
Journalists are not the only victims of Mexico's climate of fear. Students, activists, migrants and others suffer injustice and violence, often on a terrifying scale. But if murder and disappearance continue to haunt the Mexican news media, if cartels and corrupt officials can silence journalists with the gun, and if convictions for these crimes are seldom seen, these stories may become even harder to tell.
And finally, for a man in political exile in Moscow, Edward Snowden has a global profile that would be the envy of many. Citizen4, the documentary about him, won an Academy Award earlier this year, and next year we'll see Snowden the movie starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt as the source himself. The former U.S. National Security Agency contractor who opened the debate on government surveillance has appeared on big screens at international conferences and on small screens in televised interviews. However, one place that Edward Snowden had not been seen nor heard was Twitter, until last week when he opened his account. Snowden's first words to the Twitterverse were a simple question: "Can you hear me now?" There's been a flood of followers, more than 1 million and counting, although Snowden himself says he's only following one account, that of his former employer, the NSA. And you can bet that the agency is returning the favor. We'll leave you with some of the best replies to Edward Snowden's very first tweet, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.